He ran toward gunfire the way other men lean into applause. Robert Capa was a man with no fixed country and a borrowed name. He coaxed history out of its foxhole and into the open, catching it mid-stride, mid-scream, and mid-fall. The camera surely trembled in his hands, and yet the pictures were steady as a surgeon's nerve. You've seen them all by now. Surf breaking around a soldier's waist at Omaha, a militiaman folding at the knee as if the wind dropped out of him in Spain. But what you may not have seen is the tumultuous, dangerous and tragic man who hit the shutter. He laughed easily, gambled hard, and turned fear into a working method. And for a long time, Capa's luck held, until one afternoon, it didn't. Welcome to Society Mysteries. He began as Endre Erno Friedman, a tailor's son born in Budapest in 1913, and this was a city already running a fever of politics and police boots. Adolescence arrived with the blunt force characteristic of the European interwar years, joblessness, demonstrations, and a leftist student circle that made the authorities watch him closely. Then he faced a choice: leave or be made small, or even disappear altogether. So he left. First for Berlin and its quicksilver Weimar twilight, then fled again in 1933 as the goose-stepping brown tide rose and the radios crackled with a single notorious voice. Capa was Jewish, and Germany was no longer a place he could live safely. Like so many others fleeing at this time, Paris took him in. 1930s Paris was the city of artistic excitement, cheap rooms and expensive dreams, a city where a refugee could shoot pictures all day and still go hungry by night. In the sideways economy of life in exile, talent alone would not pay. You needed a persona. With his companion Gerda Pohorila, soon to be Gerda Taro, he decided to invent a more marketable, entirely fictional man, an adventurous American pro with a name that snapped like a shutter: Robert Capa. The two lovers reinvented themselves in the form of this non-existent American, and it was a harder task for Gerda than for young Friedman. She was already famous in radical art circles, and infamous in political ones. Taro was also Jewish and had managed to slip out of Leipzig after being arrested for publishing anti-Nazi propaganda. Funnily enough, editors who might haggle with a hungry Hungarian paid handsomely for an American they'd never met. And by the time the ruse was discovered, it was too late to go back. The name had stuck to the pictures like developer to paper. What began as a hustle then hardened into a real identity, and Friedman became Capa full-time, while Gerda continued to manage their business. The persona fit him like a well-tailored suit. It gave him a showman's wit, a gambler's daring, and a vow of proximity to the action. As he put it himself, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. Spain was the real crucible for all of this. In 1936, Capa and Taro took the new names to a new war, stepping into a country that had split like an old seam. While Italy and Germany rolled out the carpet for fascism, Spain, at least some of it, decided to fight it. So Capa and Taro moved with Republican fighters, slept on floors, sprinted behind walls, and worked with cameras like soldiers used rifles, always near at hand, always refilled. Capa's negatives from that first year are almost breath-misted with their closeness to the reality of the Spanish Civil War. They show men in caps and bandoliers charging over dust, civilians studying bomb-crushed streets, and the wiry intimacy of people trying to live inside a growing catastrophe. One frame, however, detonated beyond all the others. It shows a soldier at the instant of collapse, arms flung, head thrown back, the ground about to declare its claim. The falling soldier was printed and reprinted across continents, and it was read as the first moment of death photograph to enter wide circulation. It made Capa famous. It also made him a target of suspicion, and there has long been a lingering question. Was it staged? Was the hill in the background the wrong hill? The front the wrong front? José Manuel Susperegui matched ridgelines and shook his head. Richard Whelan countered with the possibility that opposing soldier was actually shot mid-pose, because the history tends to be messy with terrible ironies like that, particularly when it's being recorded in the spray of dust and adrenaline. Capa, for his part, simply said his camera, quote, caught a man at the moment when he was shot and kept moving. The argument, like so many arguments about pictures, outlived everyone in the frame. But whether it was staged or real, the picture said everything it ever needed to about the war in Spain. The price of Spain came due quickly. In July 1937 at Brunete, a Republican tank collided with a car on which Tara was standing to get a shot and crushed the life out of her. She was 26, a pioneer and suddenly a martyr, often named as the first female photojournalist killed on assignment. Their relationship had been passionate, combustible, and competitive. They had shot different fronts, and the same fronts from different angles, fighting for space in magazines like View. The intensity of war and work fused them even tighter. Capa, emotionally shattered, did what he always did. He worked. He said while still in Spain that, quote, the truth is the best propaganda, and went back to the front lines to look for it. But the loss altered his stride. The photographs he made afterward carry an undertone of fatalism, the understanding that no one, least of all the person behind the lens, is exempt from the cold arithmetic of a war. By the late 1930s, he ranged farther, to China in 1938 to record another country being broken by invasion, to London as the Blitz turned night into an X-ray show, and south with Allied troops pressing through North Africa and up the Italian peninsula. He functioned like an extra pair of eyes for readers who would never have to leave their living rooms, framing foxholes and bivouacs, quick smokes and quiet prayers, the tiny human scale of a global conflagration. The US military would later recognize the usefulness of that labor, awarding him the Medal of Freedom for pictures that, in their way, fought for the same verdict as bullets and ballots. Capa worked for magazines that bought his film by the yard, including Vue, Collier's and Life, and he gave them a feeling that the news had nerve endings. However, everything before D-Day felt like rehearsal. Everything after was only coda. On the night of June 5, 1944, he boarded an assault transport in English darkness with the 16th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Division and tried to keep his hands from shaking. All around him, soldiers vomited in fear and from the choppy waters of the Channel, teenage boys being sent to the closest recreation of hell that humanity has forged so far. Dawn found him in waist-deep water, 2 contacts slung like grenades, the air stitched by machine gun fire and plaster dust. He ran, he stumbled, and he made pictures in shards. The images are blurred not because they were careless, but because the world itself was blurred with speed and terror. He would later describe his fingers as jittery enough to mash the film, a concession to fear that made him sound human, and made his untrained, unarmed survival even more astonishing. After roughly half an hour of what any sane person would call far too much, he climbed onto a craft outbound with the wounded and collapsed on deck, a paper pinned to him that read, "Exhaustion case no dog tags." The film went ashore without him, got rushed to London, and proceeded to become a 20th century myth. The story the world loved was this. He had shot 106 frames on Omaha Beach. Then, in an astonishing cock-up, the lab had nearly baked them to oblivion. Only 11 milky, tremulous images had survived, what became known as the Magnificent 11. The rest, the crown jewels of terror, were gone forever. That was the legend that life printed and which subsequent decades lacquered. Later, the ledger of this tale was somewhat rebalanced. Editors recanted, experts explained that film doesn't melt like wax, and a clear-eyed reconsideration suggested that there was no grand catastrophe in the darkroom, only a small human-sized yield under superhuman pressure. So, in fact, maybe he landed later than he said, left earlier than he remembered, and shot fewer pictures than anyone wanted to count. The revisionists called it myth-making by Capa, a bundle of lies to advance his superhuman reputation. The defenders replied that courage and veracity are not measured by frame count, and that those 11 frames, whether they were 11 or 80, still carry the horror no one was meant to see like a scent. Investigative journalist Alex Kershaw, not a sentimentalist, said they remain the best D-Day pictures, and that they are real, which is to say, they do the one thing a photograph must do, Hold fast to a moment that tries to wriggle away into history. From Normandy onward, Capa seemed to have the war on retainer. He rode into Paris in August, as the city lifted its head above water and discovered it had survived it all relatively unscathed, at least physically. He parachuted with the 17th Airborne into Germany in March 1945, literally jumping back into a country he had once fled. By VE Day, he had threaded more battlefields than most generals and somehow also kept his sense of humour intact, a survivorship trick that his friends said masked a bone-deep weariness. The US military's Medal of Freedom formalised the gratitude, and his own book, slightly out of focus, formalised the swagger. This was a memoir that admitted he sometimes stretched the truth when the straight line couldn't bear the weight of the story. What Capa made with the camera were artworks, not pure documentary, and the representation of the truth was truer than the cold facts themselves. War ended, and yet it also refused to, at least in Capa's head. He swore off the front lines at least, and for a while kept that personal oath. Then, Hollywood tempted him with sun and social celebrity. He played the part of the quick-witted European in borrowed tuxedos, preposterously handsome, even showing up in a cameo here and there. Once, for example, as a Turkish cigarette vendor in 1946's Merle Oberon and George Brent Noir, Temptation. It was enough to prove the camera liked him both ways. The laugh suited his extroversion, late dinners, good jokes, poker games that rattled the ice in the glass. But the affair with Ingrid Bergman shifted him into a higher orbit altogether. They met in Paris in 1945, while she was touring for the troops, and the chemistry flared in public. In 1946, he followed her to Los Angeles and tried on domesticity the way one tries on a suit. Their relationship was cut well, beautiful, and yet a touch too snug when you need to move. Bergman wanted a divorce and then a marriage. Capa loved her, but he declined the second half of the proposal. "I am not the marrying kind," he told her, which was less a line than a diagnosis. By 1947, they parted like two professionals who respect each other's vocation. Alfred Hitchcock, a sharp-eared connoisseur of such things, would later rework their romantic dynamic into Rear Window, the restless photojournalist, the luminous woman asking him to come home. Life imitating art, imitating life. If the post-war years loosened Capa's tie, they also focused his intention. In New York, in 1947, he co-founded Magnum Photos with Henri Cartier-Bresson, David Shim Seymour, and George Roger, a cooperative conceived to wrest control back to the people who made the images. Photographers would own their negatives, choose their assignments, shape their own narratives, the sort of independence journalists usually dream about over their second drink and never quite achieve. Capa's charisma did half the fundraising by itself, and his conviction did the rest, a belief that author-driven photojournalism could travel farther, ask better questions, and answer to something more durable than this week's editorial fashion. Magnum became a lasting frame for other people's vision and, in time, his greatest bequest, apart from the pictures themselves. The wanderer in him never quite healed, though. He made peacetime work with the same curiosity he had brought to trenches, fashion shoots that knew how style survives, travel portfolios that favoured the human face over the postcard landscape, and even a Russian journey with John Steinbeck that tried to see beyond the clichés of the Cold War's opening act. Then war called again. In 1948, he went to the new state of Israel and the bloody fighting that midwifed this nation into being. He was nicked by gunfire in Tel Aviv and after told friends he was finished with that kind of work. Again. For a few years, he acted as Magnum's president and impresario, organizing a retrospective for Gerda Taro and keeping the lights on, sometimes literally with poker winnings. Friends said the daredevil facade remained, but the eyes had picked up an extra lamplight of fatigue. The café tables of Paris were once more his office. At last, he could order a drink without glancing at the exits and assessing useful cover. He could almost believe that he had moved beyond the old addiction to risk. Almost. His creed of get close had always been both an aesthetic and a serious health hazard. It gave his work body heat and splash, the shudder of proximity, the smudged elegance that only occurs when the photographer is inside the event rather than looking down from a balcony. It also contributes heavily to actuarial tables. By the early 1950s, Capa was a veteran whose occupation had outlived its era. The industry he helped create kept demanding new frontiers. Korea, Indochina, the places where empires were not going gentle into their good night. He kept saying no. The poker games at Le Select were fine, the Paris cafes forgiving, but the stillness was unbearable. And then circumstances, money, restlessness, the tug of one last assignment pushed the answer toward maybe. Indochina was the French Army's slow-motion disaster, a colonial war sliding toward its final humiliation. Capa told friends it wasn't his kind of story, but he accepted anyway. Maybe it was the money, maybe the familiar siren of risk. He packed his cameras and left as if responding to the echo of his own motto, be close, closer, closest. Vietnam in May was a green furnace, thick with rain and fatigue. Capa followed French units through rice paddies and hamlets where no one trusted anyone for more than 5 minutes. The soldiers, however, adored him. Here was the famous photographer who shared their cigarettes and refused to ride in the safer trucks. He walked ahead of convoys, crouched beside machine gunners, joked about how slow the war moved compared to Normandy. On May 25, 1954, he accompanied a patrol through the Red River Delta, camera bag bouncing against his hip. The patrol paused at a muddy rise, and Capa, impatient for a better angle, stepped off the track. It was a fatal move. There was a horrifying metallic click, then a flat, brutal detonation. The explosion blew him back into the air. When a French reporter reached him moments later, Capa was still conscious, his hands clutching the camera to his chest as if it could stop the bleeding. He died before they reached a field hospital, the last roll of film still inside the machine. He was 40 years old. It was a death almost too neat, the ending an editor might have rejected as contrived. The man who lived through 5 wars, undone by one careless step. But for those who knew him, it fit the fatal geometry of his life. Capa had always operated on the thin line between witness and participant, believing that the moral right to show horror demanded physical proximity to it. The mind didn't discriminate. It simply completed the logic of his own method, proximity. News of his death reached Paris and New York in the same breath. Was the risk worth it? Asked his biographer, Alex Kershaw, decades later, already knowing that the question can only ever hang unanswered in the air. Capa himself had given the closest thing to an answer years earlier. The war photographer's greatest wish is for unemployment. He hadn't been granted that wish. They buried him first in Hanoi, then brought him home to American soil, where the Foreign Correspondents Association gave him a hero's farewell. In Paris, Cartier-Bresson called an emergency meeting of Magnum. David Chim Seymour, his friend from the agency, flew east to take over Capa's assignment and was killed himself 2 years later in Egypt. Magnum went on, but the heart of it, the mischievous, reckless drive that had kept it human, was gone. Capa's story, taken as a whole, reads like a parable about the 20th century, the dislocated European intellectual who turns witness to its worst convulsions, who believes in the camera as both shield and confession. He loved women and card games, drank too much, larked around with Hemingway, and joked about cowardice while running toward the noise. In company, he was convivial, in the field, single-minded. There was something romantic in his contradictions, the foreigner reinvented as American myth, the man of showmanship who secretly longed for peace. The real secret of his appeal lay in empathy. He photographed soldiers not as symbols, but as individuals caught between instruction and instinct. His pictures of refugees and civilians carry a tenderness rare in wartime work. The fatigue in a child's face, the hand of one woman guiding another through rubble. Even at his most daring, he wasn't hunting spectacle. He was hunting proof of life amid collapse. Look again at the anonymous militiaman mid-fall, and you see the modern age learning what it means to look at its own violence. Capa's lens made war personal, and in doing so, made it impossible to ignore. The shutter closed, the myth began, and the man who hoped to stay unemployed became immortal. Alright, hope you enjoyed this look at one of the greatest and most complex figures of the 20th century. Let me know what you think of Capa by leaving me a comment, and be sure to subscribe to Society Mysteries. I've been Chester, have a good one, I'll see you next time. Cheers.